Hi guys, today we are going to get into some modern Middle Eastern issues in the 20th century. So we're going to take a step back, review a little decolonization stuff, and then look at Iraq, Iran, and a little bit of Afghanistan to bring us up to speed with these places in the Middle East. As we reviewed in some classes, but not all, the modern map of the Middle East was created after the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War One. So part of the disastrous Paris Peace Conference is kind of part of the Treaty of Versailles move. They granted the Middle East some semblance of self-determination, but in the form of the mandate system, which we see here on the map. And similar like they did in Africa, the French and the British drew borders and then set themselves up as like the mentors of these budding politicians in these new mandates of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and the Transjordan. And by doing this, they will, create issues because we're going to create borders that don't really reflect the ethnic and religious needs of the place. So remember, when we have more organic creation of states, it will reflect, different forms of nationalism. So this map that we see here is titled What the Middle East Should Look Like, and it's not perfect by any means, and you could argue a lot of stuff. But a few things that you might notice, such as what they call the Arab Shia state, reflects that the actual majority of Shia in what is now Iraq are abused essentially in many years of Iraqi history. So maybe they should have their own state. Also, notably, the Kurds, right, who are spanning all over Turkey and parts of Syria and Iraq. They are a very distinct ethnic group, and they should probably have their own state. So by drawing these random borders, we are setting ourselves up for later conflicts and issues, just like we did in Africa. Also, the British and the French are going to groom politicians who will be good to them. So we're creating a different class of imperial pets, like we do in Iraq. So once the mandate system was set up for Iraq and all the other states, they began to implant certain leaders who would be good to the British and French and the general European interests. In the case of Iraq, they appointed King Faisal I, seen here. And he was fairly famous because of his background. He's part of the Hashemite family, which we haven't talked about in a while, but it should sound familiar. That's the royal family that claims descendants from Muhammad, so pretty famous. But he was already controversial as he was run out of Syria, and then the British picked him up and put him into the state of Iraq. And what's going to happen in many of these states, and absolutely in Iraq, is that there's resentment that this guy is the leader and not another group. And of course, the resentment that we have all these ethnic groups kind of crammed into this country that aren't necessarily Arab, or they may be Shia. So we have a series of coups, rebellions, and changes of government between 1920 through the late 50s, early 60s. By 1960, one political party seems to be harnessing the sense of Arab nationalism that is very anti-European, pro-Arab, but not necessarily pro-Islam. They're proud of Islam, but they're not trying to be an Islamic party per se. And this party is called the Ba'ath Party. So the Ba'ath Party is a pan-Arab party that wants to promote a sense of Arab linguistic and nationalist unity. They wanted to modernize and make the Arab world fully independent from the European world. They also have a central belief in socialism and usually a one-party state, which means militarism. So all these things are kind of wrapped up in the sense that we must make the Arab world strong to stand up to the Europeans and be fully independent. Saddam Hussein will rise through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq to become essentially the dictator of Iraq. But originally, the United States and the Western powers promoted the Ba'ath Party because, first and foremost, they're secular in nature. While they are pro-Islam, they didn't want to incorporate that into their governments. They're also anti-communist. So even though they incorporated some socialist ideals into their government, they're anti-communist. And so the U.S. supported the rise of Saddam Hussein, particularly in Iraq, as seen here in this picture of former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. But of course, as Saddam Hussein continues to be in power, he's pushing the sense of pro-Arab nationalism, single-party state, but we have a diversity of political opinions, ethnicities in Iraq is seen here. Iraq is very diverse. If we see certain sections, the Shia are in the majority, we have the Kurds up north, and then Baghdad's right in the center. And so his rule will silence all those against him. So Saddam Hussein will live with the borders that the British had set up back in 1920, even though it's put all these ethnic groups all in the same country. And even though the goal was Arab nationalism, and not everyone in Iraq is Arab, and we have the religious diversity, even though he's asking for people to view their government as secular, not everyone is willing to do that. That's why his rule will become very violent as he's trying to live out this Ba'athist philosophy in his diverse nation. The other issue at hand at this moment is the sense of Arab supremacy in the region is at odds with the Persian nationalism that is also brewing in this time period with the growth of modern Iran. So we haven't talked about Persia in a little while. The last time we talked about them was with the Safavid Empire, which will eventually fall due to just a lot of kind of financial mismanagement. They're getting beaten up on both sides between the Mughal and the Ottoman Empire. The next dynasty to rise to power is the Qajar dynasty, which is very similar to the Safavid. They are Shia Muslim, and they are actually very similar to the Ottoman Empire in that they won't industrialize, and so as a result, they will become very dependent on other European powers. And on this map, we can see a series of territories that the Qajar dynasty lost to generally Russia and Great Britain, and some territories they lost also to the Turks. And they lose these things in a series of unequal treaties, very similar to the capitulations of the Ottoman Empire. The British and the Russians become particularly interested in this region as they begin to find out just how many resources they have. So notably oil, when that's found around their Gulf, the British set up an Anglo-Iranian oil company, which is the predecessor to British Petroleum, or BP today, and so they become obsessed with this region. So the Qajar will rule similar to how the Ottoman sultans ruled, dependent on them. The Qajar sultans and their art are also really interesting. As noted here, they really liked eyebrows and swords. Just a lot of eyebrows and cool outfits. And they also liked cross-dressing, as you can see in this image right here. In 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi, seen here, staged a coup to overthrow the Qajar Shah. And in his new government, his goal was to modernize Iran and to make it more independent. And during his reign, he did absolutely modernize parts of Iran. Seen here, we can see that people lived a pretty kind of modern lifestyle. Looks very much like it did in the United States, you know, at the kind of height of the Pahlavi dynasty. So women attended university. A lot of people were going to school. Islam had only a moderate presence within the culture. And so there are a lot of kind of freedoms. But some people do criticize that Pahlavi only modernized the urban centers and left the more rural sections, you know, open to conservatism, didn't put the schools in, so they fell to the more fundamentalist sects of Islam that were brewing in Iran. Thus, we'll get the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Another complaint is that they were a little too pro-Western. In one agreement that Pahlavi signed with the British, he agreed that in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and Iran has a ton of oil, that Iran would only get 16% of the oil profits. So stuff like that, and seemingly bowing to the West, angered a great portion of people. In 1951, there was an election that ousted the Shah and put Mohammad Mossadegh in power, who was a moderate politician, but more nationalist. He wanted to nationalize oil, which would have kicked the British out and obviously angered them, amongst other policies. And all of this set the stage for the coup that the Americans and the British worked with the conservatives in Iran with in 1953. So in 1953, the American, British, and Iranian intelligence agencies worked with the Pahlavi family to oust Mossadegh and to install Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. So Mossadegh, in many ways, had it coming if we think about the politics of the Cold War, in that not only was he nationalizing, thus kicking out the British and American investments, but he seemed to be moving towards, socialism and communism. So that frightened them. Thus, we have the coup. And the coup was very unpopular. While the upper classes and conservatives were happy to keep their relationship with the West, the majority of Iran looked at this as a foreign intrusion. And so we see a lot of anti Western sentiment. Also, in order to silence their opposition, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi really cracked down on the clerics as the Shia clerics began to spin Operation Ajax as an attack on Islam. And so, because there's so much, kind of anger and resentment, many people begin to turn towards the clerics as the voice of the true Iranians. And we start to see the rise of the clerics as a political class, as a political party, and many people throwing support behind them, maybe not because they are very devout Muslims, but they feel that they better represent the Iranian common person's interest. Thus, all this resentment building up. Thus, by 1979, the clerics have enough power to stage the 1979 revolution. Even though only about 20% of Iranians really supported the revolution, those 20% of people were so organized. And the rest of the population of Iran wasn't particularly in love with the Shah. Thus, this 20% is able to overcome. And we establish a theocracy where the clerics are informing the president of Iran, and the Sharia law of Shia Islam becomes the law of the land. The biggest issue with the establishment of Iran's theocracy is that anyone who was an intellectual or secular or atheist or in any way not falling in line with the clerics would be punished, right, and oppressed in this new regime. So a lot of people will go to jail, and their armies will look for them and censor them. A great deal of censorship. So often many of the Iranian intellectuals fled. So they left for Europe, other parts of the Middle East, and for the United States. And so Iran went through a great brain drain. So many of their intellectuals and scientists left, making Iran more vulnerable to fundamentalism, as a lack of education usually does lead to more extreme forms of political or religious beliefs. Also, famously, women, their lives changed rapidly, as some were barred from university. They were required to cover chador. There is a morality police called the Komita that always monitors everyone's behaviors. They'll do random home raids to make sure you're not drinking. They make sure that women are, if they're with a man in public, that they are related to them. They'll check women for their proper chador coverings or if they're wearing makeup. But what I love about Iran is you can tell that most people are not in line with the government in the little ways that they rebel, such as these women, obviously made up, even though they're still covered up. And back in 2009, when the election was obviously corrupt, as Mahmoud Ahmadinejad won with like 100% of the vote, we saw a revolution where people took to the streets and protested their government. So even though the government of Iran makes it seem as if everybody's in line with their vision, it is safe to assume that via all this, we know that most of Iran has a different vision for their country and are hoping that will open up. So this newfound sense of Shia Iranian theocratic nationalism is growing at the same time as Saddam Hussein sets his goal to become sort of the supreme leader of the Arab world. Saddam Hussein is very threatened by this growing Shia nationalism, afraid that it will infect the Shia in his country, who are a slight majority. Likewise, the rest of the world has their eye on this as Islamic fundamentalism is growing. At the same time, the US is a little worried about the actions of Saddam Hussein. But in the follow-up video that you are going to watch, I want you to note the basics of the war. It's an 8-year war. Over 1 million people die. It's a really bad one. But I do want you to note what the outside world does. What does the U.S. do? What role do they play? What does Saudi Arabia do? Etc. So you're going to watch a follow-up video to that, and there are questions about it coming up. The other country I'm going to briefly introduce, but you have a follow-up video, is Afghanistan. So this is a map of the ethnic makeup of Afghanistan. So to see, it's an extremely diverse nation, various groups. The Pashtun and the Hazara people are the majority, but everybody's all scattered. And so Afghanistan as a nation is a pretty new entity. It's been absorbed into multiple empires throughout time, as far back as like the Mongol Empire and the Safavid Empire. And in the late 1700s, Ahmad Shah Durrani, who was considered like the George Washington of Afghanistan, helped the Afghani people break free from the Safavid Empire. And after this, we see a series of governments, and all of them have to combat Western influence. So, starting in the early 1800s, Russia and Great Britain have their eye on Afghanistan, as they have their eye on the whole area. And eventually, this whole competition between Great Britain and Russia is known as the Great Game, since that's not messed up. And originally, the Afghanis defeat the British. They're one of the few to like take it to the British. So, we should have learned that lesson to not mess with the Afghanis. Although eventually they do fall to British power, and they kind of set up kind of like similar to the Ottoman Empire, these spheres of influence. And by the end of the 1800s, the Afghani politicians take a note from the Young Turks and begin to set up a series of reforms, such as compulsory education for children, to make the veil optional for women, amongst other things. But all this does is really force a divide between the very tribal governments up north and the more urban and connected, or at least internationally connected, governments and civilizations down south. So by mid-century, large portions of Afghanistan are very modern and look quite like the West, as you see here in some of these pictures, where we see some women are veiled and some are not, and the fashion is indeed very Western, and there's a great deal of infrastructure. In fact, we see in this one picture on the left, this one's kind of square, is very beautiful and well maintained, and of course, years of war will change that. But in the 70s, there is a Marxist revolution that will oust the government, the Sawa Revolution by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, that rose up in the face of what they considered puppet regimes and kind of hyper-capitalist ideologies. And while this was a damaging revolution, more damaging is the Russian reaction to this. In response to this and feeling like they would lose influence, and some people believe in an attempt at a land grab and to push their way towards the Persian Gulf, the Russians invade in 1978 and lead a long, protracted war in Afghanistan through 1988. Many people consider this one of the biggest reasons that the Soviet Union falls, as it becomes kind of their Vietnam, but far worse in terms of all the money that they sink into this effort. And it's during the Russian invasion that we see political vacuums open up, which allow for the rise first of the Mujahideen warlords, and eventually the Taliban, which we will learn more about via these other videos that you'll be watching in class. All right, so now switch over to the other videos that I linked so you can get a better understanding of the rise of the Taliban and their infamous treatment of women, and do the follow-up reflection. Thanks.